My name is Elena, and I was standing barely 2 inches from a Monet water lily painting when the security guard's voice cut through the gallery like a blade. "Step back from the artwork, ma'am. No touching." His tone was sharp, dismissive, the kind reserved for tourists who didn't understand the rules. The elderly woman beside me smirked and whispered to her companion, "Some people have no respect for fine art." But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been staring at that particular painting every morning for the past 3 years. Not because I was just another visitor, but because I owned it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This isn't just a story about a misunderstanding. This is about the moment when everything I had quietly built, everything I had donated in shadow, everything I had given without wanting credit, suddenly came to light in the most unexpected way. Let me take you back to where this all began, because the story isn't really about that moment in the gallery. It starts 25 years earlier, in a cramped studio apartment in Portland, Oregon, where I was working 3 jobs just to pay rent and dreaming of a world that felt impossibly far away. I was 22 then, fresh out of college, with an art history degree that everyone told me was worthless. My professors had been kind but realistic. "There's no money in art appreciation, Elena," they said. "Maybe consider teaching or museum administration." But I didn't want to teach. I didn't want to sit behind a desk processing paperwork. I wanted to be surrounded by beauty, by creativity, by the kind of work that made people stop breathing for just a moment when they saw it. My family never understood this passion. My mother, a practical woman who had immigrated from Lithuania with nothing but a suitcase and fierce determination, would shake her head whenever I talked about art. "You can't eat paintings, Elena," she would say in her accented English. "You can't pay rent with beautiful thoughts." My father, who worked double shifts at a manufacturing plant, was even more direct. "Art is for rich people who have nothing better to do with their money." They weren't being cruel, they were being realistic. We lived paycheck to paycheck, and the idea of spending money on something purely for beauty seemed not just impractical, but irresponsible. When I graduated and announced I was moving to Portland to work at galleries, my mother cried. Not tears of pride, but tears of worry. She was convinced I was throwing my life away. The reality was harsher than even she had predicted. The gallery jobs paid barely above minimum wage, and most of them were part-time. I spent my days at Morrison Gallery, a small contemporary space in the Pearl District, and my evenings waiting tables at a restaurant downtown. On weekends, I worked at a coffee shop just to make ends meet. My studio apartment was so small I could touch both walls if I stretched my arms out, and I lived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. But I was happy. Or at least, I thought I was. Every day I got to see incredible art, to talk to artists about their process, to watch people discover a piece that spoke to them. The gallery owner, Margaret Chen, was in her 60s and had been in the art world for decades. She became something of a mentor to me, teaching me not just about the business side of art, but about how to really see. "Most people look at art like they're checking items off a list," she told me one afternoon as we hung a new exhibition. "They want to say they saw the famous painting, they want the Instagram photo. But you, Elena, you actually see. You understand that art isn't decoration. It's communication." Margaret was the first person who made me believe that my passion for art was valuable, not just personally fulfilling. She taught me about provenance, about the stories behind pieces, about how to spot emerging talent. Under her guidance, I started to develop an eye for quality and potential that went beyond just personal taste. The turning point came during my 3rd year at Morrison Gallery. We were hosting an exhibition for a young artist named David Kowalski, a painter whose work explored themes of displacement and identity. His paintings were raw, emotional, and completely captivating. But the opening night was sparse. Portland's art scene was small, and David was unknown. By the end of the evening, we had sold exactly 1 piece, a small canvas for $800. I watched David's face fall as people filtered out without making purchases. He had been so hopeful, so nervous and excited. Margaret put her arm around his shoulder and said something encouraging, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. This was his big chance, his moment to make it as an artist, and it was slipping away. That night, I went home to my tiny apartment and did something that probably wasn't rational. I had been saving money for months, hoping to maybe put a down payment on a better place to live. It was $3,000, every spare cent I had managed to scrape together from tips and careful budgeting. Instead of using it for rent, I went back to the gallery the next morning and bought 3 of David's paintings. I didn't tell Margaret it was me. I didn't tell David. I had her list me as an anonymous buyer, paying in cash, and arranged to have the paintings stored at the gallery since I had nowhere to hang them anyway. When David found out that morning that he had sold 3 more pieces overnight, the joy on his face was worth every dollar. That was the beginning of something I couldn't have predicted. Over the following months, I started buying more art. Not expensive pieces, not famous names, but work by emerging artists who needed support. A ceramic sculpture here, a photograph there, always paying in cash, always anonymous. I lived even more frugally than before, surviving on crackers and canned soup, but each purchase felt like an investment in something meaningful. Word started to spread quietly through Portland's art community about a mysterious collector who was supporting local artists. Gallery owners would whisper to each other about cash sales with no name attached, about someone who seemed to have excellent taste and a particular interest in helping newcomers. I never confirmed or denied anything when people speculated around me. I just smiled and kept working. The real change came when I turned 26. My grandmother, my mother's mother, who had remained in Lithuania, passed away and left me an inheritance that no one in my family had expected. She had been quietly saving money for decades, living in the same small house, never spending on herself. When the lawyers contacted me, I learned that she had left me nearly $40,000 along with a letter written in Lithuanian that my mother translated for me. Elena, the letter read, "Your mother tells me you love beautiful things. In Lithuania, when I was young, we had no money for beautiful things. The war took everything from us. But now you have a chance to live differently. Don't let practical people convince you that beauty is worthless. Beauty is what makes us human." I cried reading those words, partly from grief, but mostly from a profound sense of being understood. My grandmother, who I had only met a few times during childhood visits, had seen something in me that my own parents struggled to accept. With that inheritance, my collecting became more serious. I educated myself obsessively, reading art magazines, attending lectures, visiting museums whenever I could travel. I learned about different movements, different techniques, about how to evaluate not just the aesthetic value of a piece but its historical significance and potential for appreciation. I was still working at Morrison Gallery, but I started making connections with other galleries, other dealers, other collectors. My reputation as an anonymous buyer began to spread beyond Portland. I would receive calls from dealers in Seattle, San Francisco, even New York, telling me about pieces they thought might interest me. I always asked to remain unnamed in any transactions, which created an air of mystery that seemed to intrigue people in the art world. By the time I was 30, I owned over 200 pieces of art. Not all of them were valuable in monetary terms, but each one had been chosen carefully, either because I loved it or because I believed in the artist who created it. Many of the artists I had supported early in their careers were starting to gain recognition. David Kowalski, whose paintings I had bought that first night, now had work in major museums. A photographer named Sarah Martinez, whose series on immigrant families I had purchased when she could barely afford film, had just won a prestigious national award. But I still lived modestly. I had moved to a larger apartment, but it was still small by most standards. I drove a used Honda Civic and bought my clothes at thrift stores. All of my money went toward art, toward supporting creativity, toward being part of something larger than myself. The art world, I learned, was full of ego and pretension. Collectors who bought expensive pieces just to show off their wealth, who cared more about name recognition than artistic merit. Dealers who manipulated prices and created artificial scarcity to drive up demand. Artists who compromised their vision to chase commercial success. I wanted no part of that world, even as I was increasingly becoming a significant player in it. When I turned 35, I made a decision that would change everything. I had been collecting for over a decade, and my collection had grown not just in size but in value. Some of the pieces I had bought for hundreds of dollars were now worth tens of thousands. The artists I had supported were established now, successful, and grateful. But I was starting to feel like the collection was becoming a burden rather than a joy. I was spending more time managing acquisitions, dealing with insurance, worrying about security and climate control, than I was actually enjoying the art itself. Most of the pieces were in storage, because I couldn't display them all. The whole point of art, I believed, was to be seen, to move people, to create dialogue and emotion. What good was a beautiful painting sitting in a climate-controlled warehouse? That's when I started making anonymous loans to museums. The first loan was to the Portland Art Museum. I contacted the curator of contemporary art and offered to lend 5 pieces for a year-long exhibition on emerging Northwest artists. 3 of the pieces were by artists who had become quite successful, and the museum was thrilled to have access to work they otherwise couldn't afford to acquire. I insisted on complete anonymity, listed only as private collection in all materials. Seeing those pieces on museum walls watched by hundreds of visitors every week gave me more satisfaction than owning them ever had. I stood in the galleries during opening night, listening to people discuss the work, watching children point excitedly at colors and shapes, observing couples debate the meaning of different pieces. This was what art was meant to do. Not sit in storage, not appreciate silently in value, but engage with the world. Over the next few years, I started lending more pieces to more institutions. The Seattle Art Museum, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, smaller galleries and university museums across the West Coast. I developed relationships with curators who knew me only as a voice on the phone or a signature on legal documents. They trusted my taste, valued my willingness to lend without seeking credit, and began to rely on my collection to fill gaps in their exhibitions. But I was still working at Morrison Gallery, still living my modest life in Portland. Margaret Chen was now in her 70s and had been talking about retirement. The gallery was struggling financially, like many small arts organizations, and I could see that she was worried about what would happen to the space and the artists she represented. One evening, after a particularly disappointing opening where we sold nothing, Margaret and I were cleaning up glasses and talking about the state of the art market. She was discouraged, wondering if small galleries could survive in an increasingly commercial art world. "You know," she said, "sometimes I think the best collectors are the ones we never see. The people who buy art because they love it, not because they want to be seen at openings or get their names on museum walls. There's someone out there, some anonymous collector, who's been supporting our artists for years. I wish I knew who it was, just so I could thank them." I smiled and continued wiping down surfaces, not saying anything. Margaret had no idea that the anonymous collector she was talking about was standing right next to her, wearing a thrift store dress and washing champagne glasses. That conversation made me realize something important. My anonymity, which I had initially chosen out of humility and a desire to avoid attention, had become something more powerful. It allowed me to support art and artists without the ego and politics that usually came with collecting. It allowed the work to speak for itself, without being filtered through perceptions of who owned it or why they had bought it. When Margaret finally announced her retirement, I made her an offer she couldn't refuse, though she never knew it came from me. Through my lawyer, I purchased the gallery building and arranged for it to be donated to a nonprofit arts foundation, ensuring that Morrison Gallery would continue operating in perpetuity. Margaret was amazed by the anonymous benefactor who made this possible, and I was content to let her wonder. By the time I was 40, my collection had grown to include over 1,000 pieces, ranging from paintings and sculptures to photographs, textiles, and multimedia installations. I had works by artists who were now household names, pieces that museums around the world coveted. But I also continued to support emerging artists, buying work by people just out of art school, just starting their careers, just hoping for someone to believe in their vision. I had also started a small foundation, again completely anonymous, that provided grants to artists for materials, studio space, and living expenses. The application process was simple, and the only requirement was that applicants submit their work without including their names, ages, or backgrounds. I wanted to fund talent and vision, not demographics or connections. The foundation grew as my collection appreciated in value. Some of the pieces I had bought for modest amounts in the early days were now worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. When I sold pieces, which I did occasionally, all of the proceeds went toward supporting more artists and acquiring more work to lend to museums. I was living a double life, and I loved it. To my neighbors, I was Elena, the quiet woman who worked at an art gallery and drove an old Honda. To my mother, I was still the impractical daughter who had wasted her education on art instead of finding a sensible job. But to the art world, though they didn't know my name, I was becoming one of the most significant supporters of contemporary art on the West Coast. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had more influence and impact than many collectors whose names appeared regularly in art magazines. But because I chose to remain invisible, that influence was pure. It wasn't about ego or status or social climbing. It was about art, about creativity, about the fundamental human need to make and share beautiful things. 5 years ago, I made the decision to move to San Francisco. Portland had been good to me, but I felt ready for a change. And the Bay Area offered more opportunities to discover new artists and connect with larger institutions. I found a modest apartment in the Mission District, nothing fancy, and started exploring the local art scene. That's when I first encountered the Castellano Museum of Fine Arts, a mid-sized institution in the heart of the city that specialized in contemporary work and rotating exhibitions. The museum had an excellent reputation, but limited resources for acquisitions. Their collection was strong but not comprehensive, and they relied heavily on loans from collectors to mount their most ambitious shows. I reached out to Dr. Patricia Reeves, the museum's chief curator, and offered to lend several pieces for an upcoming exhibition on women artists of the Pacific Northwest. She was thrilled to hear from me, as my reputation as an anonymous lender had preceded me. We spoke several times on the phone, and she expressed how grateful the museum was for collectors like me who were willing to share their work with the public. "You're something of a legend among curators," she told me during one of our conversations. "We call you the ghost collector because no one's ever met you, but your pieces show up in the most important exhibitions. Your taste is impeccable, and your generosity is unmatched." The ghost collector. I liked that. It felt accurate. Over the following months, I lent more and more pieces to the Castellano Museum. Dr. Reeves and I developed a working relationship based entirely on phone calls and emails. She would describe upcoming exhibitions, I would offer pieces from my collection that might fit, and we would work out the details through my lawyer and art handlers. She began to rely on my collection to anchor major shows, knowing that my pieces would draw visitors and enhance the museum's reputation. What she didn't know was that I visited the museum regularly, usually in the afternoons when it was less crowded. I would walk through the galleries, seeing my own pieces displayed alongside works by other lenders and the museum's permanent collection. It gave me tremendous satisfaction to watch people engage with art I had chosen to support, to see families discussing paintings I had discovered in small galleries years earlier, to observe students sketching sculptures I had bought when the artists were unknown. I became a familiar face to the museum staff, just another regular visitor. The guards would nod politely when I came in. The front desk volunteers would smile and hand me a gallery map even though I knew the layout by heart. I was invisible in the best possible way, able to enjoy my collection and watch its impact without any of the attention or expectation that came with being known as a major collector. The docents, volunteers who led tours through the museum, were particularly interesting to listen to. They were knowledgeable and passionate, but they often speculated about the anonymous lenders who made certain exhibitions possible. During one tour I overheard, a docent was explaining a painting by an artist named Rebecca Lawson, whose work I had been collecting for almost 15 years. "This piece is on loan from a private collection," the docent explained to her group. "We don't know who the collector is, but they've been incredibly generous in sharing their work with museums around the country. Some people in the art world call them the ghost collector. Whoever they are, they have extraordinary taste and a real commitment to making art accessible to the public." An elderly man in the tour group raised his hand. "Why would someone want to remain anonymous? If I had enough money to collect important art, I'd want people to know about it." The docent smiled. That's exactly why this collector is so special. They're not doing it for recognition or status. They're doing it because they believe art should be shared, that it belongs in museums where everyone can see it, not locked away in private homes. It's quite rare in the collecting world. I stood at the back of the group, listening to this conversation about myself, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what I had hoped to achieve. The work was being seen, discussed, appreciated, without any focus on me or my motivations. The art was speaking for itself, but that anonymity, which had been such a source of strength and purpose, was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way. And it would happen because of a security guard who didn't know that the woman he was scolding owned half the paintings on the walls around him. 3 months ago, the Castellano Museum opened its most ambitious exhibition ever, Currents, Contemporary Art from the Pacific Coast. It was a comprehensive show spanning 30 years of artistic development in California, Oregon, and Washington, featuring over 100 pieces from dozens of lenders. Dr. Reeves had been working on this exhibition for 2 years, and nearly 40% of the works on display came from my collection. I had been looking forward to the show for months, not just because so much of my collection would be featured, but because it represented the culmination of everything I had been working toward. These were artists I had supported from the beginning of their careers, pieces I had chosen because I believed in their significance, work that was now being recognized by a major institution as historically important. The opening reception was held on a Thursday evening, and I chose not to attend. I never went to openings. They were crowded, focused more on socializing than on art, full of people who were there to be seen rather than to see. Instead, I planned to visit the following morning, when the galleries would be quiet and I could spend time with each piece without distraction. That Friday morning was clear and sunny, the kind of San Francisco day when the light streaming through the museum's skylights would make the paintings glow. I arrived shortly after the museum opened, nodded to the familiar faces at the front desk, and made my way to the main gallery where Currents was installed. The exhibition was stunning. Dr. Reeves and her team had arranged the works chronologically and thematically, creating conversations between pieces that I had never seen before. Paintings I had owned for years were displayed next to sculptures and photographs that complemented them perfectly, revealing connections and influences that weren't apparent when the works were seen in isolation. I moved slowly through the first 2 galleries, taking my time with each piece, reading the detailed wall text that provided context and interpretation. Some of the works were old friends, pieces I had lived with for years before lending them out. Others were more recent acquisitions that I was seeing in a museum context for the first time. When I reached the 3rd gallery, I encountered the Monet water lily painting that would become the center of the confrontation with the security guard. It wasn't actually by Monet, of course. It was a contemporary piece by an artist named Jennifer Walsh, who had been influenced by the Impressionists, but brought her own vision to the water lily motif. I had bought it directly from Jennifer's studio 8 years earlier, when she was still struggling to pay rent and wondering if she should give up painting entirely. The painting was one of my favorites, not because it was the most valuable piece in my collection, but because it represented everything I loved about supporting emerging artists. Jennifer had been creating beautiful work that no one was paying attention to, and a small purchase from me had given her the confidence and financial breathing room to continue developing her artistic practice. She was now represented by a major gallery in Los Angeles and had work in several museum collections. I had been standing in front of Jennifer's painting for several minutes, lost in memory and appreciation, when I noticed that I was perhaps closer to the wall than I should have been. The lighting was positioned to minimize glare, which meant that the optimal viewing distance was about 2 feet from the canvas. I was probably 6 inches closer than that, leaning in to see the texture of the brushstrokes and the subtle color variations that Jennifer achieved through her layering technique. That's when the security guard approached me. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with the kind of earnest demeanor that suggested he took his job seriously. I had seen him before during my visits to the museum, though we had never interacted directly. He walked up with confident steps and cleared his throat to get my attention. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in a voice that was loud enough to carry across the gallery. "You need to step back from the artwork. Museum policy requires visitors to maintain a safe distance from all paintings and sculptures." I looked up at him, slightly startled from my reverie, and stepped back automatically. "Of course," I said, I'm sorry, but he wasn't finished. The oils from your skin can damage the paint if you get too close, he continued, his voice becoming more lecturing in tone. And some visitors have been known to touch pieces accidentally when they lean in like that. I nodded politely, but I noticed that his comment about touching had attracted the attention of other visitors in the gallery. An elderly couple near the entrance had turned to look at us, and I could see the woman whispering something to her husband. A group of college students with sketchbooks had also paused their discussion to observe the interaction. I understand, I said quietly, hoping to end the conversation. Thank you for the reminder, but the security guard seemed to be warming to his topic. You'd be surprised how many people don't respect the art, he said, his voice carrying even further now. They think because they paid admission, they can do whatever they want. But these pieces are priceless. Some of them are worth more than most people make in a lifetime. The elderly woman from the entrance had now moved closer, close enough that I could hear her whispered comment to her companion. Some people have no respect for fine art. Her tone was disapproving, directed at me, and I felt my cheeks warm with embarrassment. I wanted to explain that I hadn't been touching anything, that I was simply trying to appreciate the brushwork, that I probably knew more about conserving artwork than anyone in the room. But explaining would only draw more attention, and attention was the last thing I wanted. So I simply nodded again and moved to a different part of the gallery. The security guard seemed satisfied with his intervention and returned to his post near the entrance. The elderly couple continued their tour, occasionally glancing back at me with expressions that suggested they were still discussing my apparent lack of gallery etiquette. The college students had gone back to their sketching, but I noticed one of them pointing discreetly in my direction while talking to her classmates. I tried to refocus on the art, moving through the rest of the exhibition, but the interaction had rattled me more than it should have. I had been coming to this museum for years, had contributed more to its exhibitions than any other single lender, and yet I was being treated like a tourist who didn't understand how to behave around valuable artwork. The irony was profound. That young security guard was protecting my own painting from me. The elderly woman who had judged my behavior was looking at art that I had chosen to share with the public. The college students who had witnessed my supposed transgression were sketching works that I had supported and nurtured from their earliest stages. But there was something else bothering me beyond just the immediate embarrassment. The guard's comment about pieces being, quote, more than most people make in a lifetime, reflected an attitude toward art that I had always found troubling. He was thinking about monetary value, about art as commodity, rather than about artistic merit or cultural significance. He was protecting these works because they were expensive, not because they were important. I finished my tour of the exhibition more quickly than I had planned, my enjoyment dimmed by the earlier confrontation. As I prepared to leave, I stopped by the museum store and bought a catalog of the Currents exhibition. The catalog was comprehensive, featuring essays by several art historians and full-color reproductions of all the works in the show. Flipping through the catalog, I was struck by how many of the pieces were listed as collection of anonymous lender or simply private collection. Nearly 40% of the exhibition came from my collection, but visitors had no way of knowing that. The catalog essays discussed the significance of various works and their place in contemporary art history, but made no mention of how these pieces had come to be available for the exhibition. That evening, I called Dr. Reeves to congratulate her on the success of the exhibition opening. She was thrilled with the response the show had received, both from critics and from the public. Elena, she said, using the name I had given her for our correspondence, though she still didn't know my full identity. I can't thank you enough for making this exhibition possible. The pieces you've lent are absolutely crucial to the show's success. The critics are calling it one of the most important surveys of West Coast contemporary art in decades. I'm so pleased to hear that, I replied. I visited the exhibition this morning, and the installation is beautiful. You and your team should be very proud. You were there? She said, sounding surprised. I wish I had known. I would have loved to meet you in person finally. Oh, I prefer to keep a low profile, I said. I like being able to enjoy the art without any fuss. Dr. Reeves laughed. You really are the ghost collector, aren't you? I have to admit, there's something romantic about your mystery. But I do hope that someday we can meet face to face. You've been such an important partner for this institution. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment thinking about what she had said. Dr. Reeves appreciated my anonymity, saw it as romantic and intriguing. But that morning at the museum, my invisibility had made me vulnerable to embarrassment and misjudgment. The security guard hadn't seen a respected collector and patron of the arts. He had seen just another visitor who needed to be managed and corrected. For the first time in my collecting career, I began to wonder if there might be value in being known, in having my contributions recognized, in being seen as more than just another face in the crowd. But that thought made me uncomfortable. Recognition had never been the point. If I wanted recognition, I could have had it years ago. Over the following weeks, I found myself returning to the Castellano Museum more frequently than usual. Something about that interaction with the security guard had lodged in my mind, and I couldn't quite let it go. I started observing the museum staff more carefully, listening to how they talked about the anonymous lenders, watching how they interacted with different types of visitors. What I noticed was a subtle hierarchy. Visitors who looked wealthy or sophisticated were treated with more deference than those who appeared to be tourists or students. Donors who were recognized were greeted warmly by staff and given special attention. Anonymous lenders like me were appreciated in the abstract, but that appreciation didn't extend to protecting us from awkward encounters with overzealous security guards. I also started paying more attention to conversations among other visitors. People were fascinated by the idea of anonymous collectors, but they also seemed to view anonymity with suspicion. Why would someone want to remain hidden? What were they trying to hide? Several times I overheard visitors speculating about the identity of major anonymous lenders, creating elaborate theories about reclusive billionaires or secretive family foundations. The truth, of course, was much more mundane. I remained anonymous not because I was mysterious or secretive, but because I believed it was the right way to collect art. I wanted the focus to be on the work itself, not on who owned it or why they had bought it. I wanted to support artists and institutions without the ego and politics that usually came with major collecting. But I was beginning to realize that my anonymity, while philosophically pure, had practical limitations. It left me vulnerable to misunderstanding and disrespect. It prevented me from advocating more effectively for the artists and institutions I supported. And it meant that my perspective and knowledge, developed over decades of serious collecting, couldn't contribute to public discourse about art and culture. 2 weeks after the security guard incident, I received a call from Dr. Reeves that would change everything. She had an urgent request, and she needed my help in a way that would make my anonymity impossible to maintain. "Elena," she said, her voice tense with excitement and anxiety, "I have an unusual situation, and I'm hoping you might be able to help. We've just received an opportunity to host a major collector and his guests for a private tour of the Currents exhibition. This collector has expressed interest in making a significant donation to the museum, possibly even funding a new wing." "That sounds wonderful," I said. "How can I help?" "Well, here's the thing. This collector is extremely knowledgeable about contemporary art, and he's specifically interested in the anonymous lenders who have made our exhibition possible. He keeps asking questions about provenance and collecting history that I can't answer because I don't know the identities of most of our lenders." I felt a flutter of anxiety in my stomach. "What kind of questions?" "He wants to know about collecting strategies, about how certain pieces were acquired, about the relationships between different works in the exhibition. He's particularly interested in the cluster of Pacific Northwest artists from the 1990s and early 2000s. He seems to suspect that several of the anonymous loans come from the same collector, and he's right, of course. Most of them come from you." Dr. Reeves paused, and I could hear her take a deep breath before continuing. "Elena, I know you value your privacy, and I've always respected that. But this could be a transformative gift for the museum. Would you consider meeting with this collector? Just this once? You could provide the kind of insight and knowledge that might convince him to support us." I stared out the window of my apartment, watching fog roll in from the bay. This was exactly the kind of situation I had always tried to avoid. Meeting with a major collector would inevitably lead to questions about my own collection, my resources, my identity. It would mean stepping out of the shadows and into the complicated world of art politics and social hierarchies that I had spent decades avoiding. I don't know, I said finally. Can you tell me more about this collector? Who is he? His name is Marcus Whitfield, Dr. Reeves said. He's based in New York, made his fortune in tech, and has been collecting seriously for about 15 years. He's known for having excellent taste and for being very strategic about his acquisitions. He's also known for being quite demanding and particular about authentication and provenance. I recognized the name. Marcus Whitfield was indeed a serious collector, the kind who appeared regularly in art magazines and whose acquisitions were covered in the art press. He was also known for being somewhat ruthless in his collecting practices, using his wealth and connections to acquire pieces that other collectors coveted. He was the opposite of everything I tried to be as a collector. When is this tour scheduled? I asked. Next Friday afternoon. He'll be in San Francisco for only one day, and this is our only opportunity to make an impression. Elena, I know this is a big ask, but you're the only person who can speak knowledgeably about the works he's most interested in. Without your insights, I'm afraid we'll miss this chance. I told Dr. Reeves that I would think about it and call her back. After we hung up, I spent the rest of the evening walking through my neighborhood, trying to decide what to do. Part of me was curious about Marcus Whitfield, about what he would think of my collection and my approach to lending. But a larger part of me was terrified of having my carefully constructed anonymity exposed. The next morning, I called Dr. Reeves back and agreed to meet with Marcus Whitfield, with one condition. I wanted to observe him first, to get a sense of who he was and how he interacted with art and museum staff, before revealing my identity as a major lender. Dr. Reeves arranged for me to be present during his tour as a volunteer docent, a role that would allow me to be part of the group while maintaining my anonymity until I decided to reveal myself. That decision would lead directly to the confrontation that would change everything, because Marcus Whitfield's visit would coincide with another encounter with the security guard who had scolded me 2 weeks earlier. And this time, the consequences of that encounter would be impossible to ignore. The morning of Marcus Whitfield's visit, I arrived at the Castellano Museum an hour early. Dr. Reeves had arranged for me to receive a temporary volunteer badge and a brief orientation about leading tours, though my role was supposed to be primarily observational. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been in years, not because I was afraid of meeting Marcus Whitfield, but because I was about to step out of the shadows that had protected me for so long. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a simple black dress, low heels, and a navy blazer. Nothing too expensive or too casual. Nothing that would mark me as either wealthy or struggling. I wanted to blend in as much as possible until I decided how much of myself to reveal. Dr. Reeves greeted me warmly in her office, though I could see the stress of the day in her expression. Elena, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this. Marcus Whitfield's people called this morning to confirm, and they emphasized again how important authentication and provenance information will be to his decision about supporting the museum. Has he given you any indication of what kind of support he's considering? I asked. His assistant mentioned figures in the 7-figure range, Dr. Reeves said quietly. It could fund our proposed expansion, or establish an endowment for acquisitions, or both. This is the kind of opportunity that comes along once in a museum's lifetime. I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. My decision to remain anonymous had always been personal, but now it was potentially affecting an institution I cared deeply about. If my unwillingness to step forward cost the museum a transformative gift, I would never forgive myself. Marcus Whitfield arrived precisely on time, accompanied by 2 assistants and a woman who was introduced as his art advisor. He was in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a custom suit, with the kind of confident bearing that came from having never been told no. He shook hands with Dr. Reeves with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to being courted by institutions seeking support. Dr. Reeves, he said, thank you for arranging this private tour. I've been looking forward to seeing your current exhibition. The catalog suggests some very interesting pieces, particularly from your anonymous lenders. We're delighted to have you here, Dr. Reeves replied. I'd like you to meet Elena, one of our volunteer docents who will be joining us today. She has particular expertise in contemporary Pacific Northwest art. Marcus Whitfield looked at me with polite but minimal interest, the way wealthy people often looked at museum staff. "Pleasure to meet you," he said, already turning his attention back to Dr. Reeves. "Shall we begin?" As we walked toward the main gallery, I listened to Marcus Whitfield's conversation with Dr. Reeves and began to understand why she had been so anxious about this visit. His questions were sharp and specific, revealing not just knowledge but a collector's instinct for identifying valuable opportunities. He wasn't just interested in the art. He was evaluating the museum as an investment. "This piece," he said, stopping in front of a large abstract painting by an artist named Robert Chen, "it's listed as an anonymous loan. Can you tell me anything about its acquisition history?" "Doctor, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Reeves glanced at me helplessly. The painting was one of mine, purchased directly from Robert's studio in 2018, when he was still experimenting with the large-scale abstract work that would eventually make his reputation. I knew every detail of its creation and provenance, but I was supposed to be just a volunteer docent. "I believe it was acquired fairly recently," Dr. Reeves said carefully. "The lender has been collecting Pacific Northwest artists for many years." Marcus Whitfield studied the painting more closely, then turned to his art advisor. "Catherine, what do you think? The brushwork suggests this is from Chen's breakthrough period, probably 2018 or 2019. If the collector got it directly from the studio, it was an excellent acquisition." Catherine nodded. "The provenance would be pristine, and Chen's market has tripled since then. Whoever bought this had extraordinary timing." I felt a flush of pride despite myself. Marcus Whitfield was exactly right about when and how I had acquired the piece, and his assessment of its significance was accurate. But I also felt uncomfortable with the way he was discussing the painting primarily in terms of market value rather than artistic merit. We continued through the exhibition, with Marcus Whitfield asking increasingly detailed questions about the anonymous loans. With each piece, it became more obvious that he suspected most of them came from a single collector, and that collector had remarkable taste and timing. Dr. Reeves grew more nervous as the tour progressed, clearly struggling to provide the kind of detailed information he was seeking. When we reached the third gallery, where Jennifer Walsh's water lily painting was displayed, Marcus Whitfield stopped and studied it for a long time. "This is exceptional," he said finally. "Walsh is just starting to get serious attention, but this piece shows she's been doing important work for years. Do you know when the collector acquired it?" "I'm not certain of the exact date," Dr. Reeves said, looking at me again with a plea in her eyes. 2016, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the tour had begun. "It was purchased directly from the artist's studio." Marcus Whitfield turned to look at me with new interest. "You seem quite knowledgeable about these acquisitions," he said. "Are you familiar with this anonymous collector's approach?" Before I could answer, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Excuse me, ma'am. She's the anonymous collector whose work makes up nearly 40% of our current exhibition." The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus Whitfield stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. His assistants exchanged glances. Dr. Reeves looked like she was holding her breath, and the security guard's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the situation weren't so mortifying. "You're," Marcus Whitfield said slowly, "you're the ghost collector?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. The security guard looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Ma'am, I had no idea. I'm so sorry." But Marcus Whitfield was studying me with new intensity. "You own this painting," he said, gesturing toward Jennifer's work, "and the Robert Chen, and probably half the pieces we've seen today." "A bit more than half, actually," I said, finding my voice. 43%, to be precise." Marcus Whitfield began to smile, and it transformed his entire demeanor. "Dr. Reeves, you've been holding out on me. I asked to meet your major anonymous lender, and you introduced her as a volunteer docent. Elena has always preferred to remain private about her collecting," Dr. Reeves said carefully. I've respected that choice, but today seemed like it might be worth making an exception. Indeed it is, Marcus Whitfield said. He extended his hand to me with a level of respect that hadn't been present in our initial introduction. Ms. Vasquez, I'm Marcus Whitfield. I've been trying to figure out the identity of the ghost collector for years. Your reputation in collecting circles is legendary. I shook his hand, still processing what had just happened. 25 years of carefully maintained anonymity had just evaporated in a single moment, triggered by a security guard who was trying to protect my own artwork from me. I understand you prefer to keep a low profile, Marcus Whitfield continued, but I have to say, your collection strategy is remarkable. You've been supporting important artists years before anyone else recognized their significance. The timing of your acquisition suggests either incredible luck or extraordinary insight. A little of both, I think, I said, starting to relax slightly. I've always believed in buying what I love and trusting my instincts about artists who are doing something original. And then lending generously to museums so the work can be seen, he added. That's increasingly rare in the collecting world. Most people want their names on wall labels. Dr. Reeves was watching this exchange with visible relief. The disaster with the security guard had somehow transformed into exactly the kind of conversation she had hoped to facilitate. Mr. Whitfield, I said, Dr. Reeves mentioned that you're considering supporting the museum. I hope my unconventional introduction hasn't affected that decision. Marcus Whitfield laughed. On the contrary, it's convinced me that this institution attracts exactly the kind of collectors I want to be associated with. People who care more about art than about recognition, who understand that the best collections are meant to be shared. He turned to Dr. Reeves. I came here today planning to make a modest donation, something in the low 6 figures. But meeting Ms. Vasquez has changed my perspective. If this museum can earn the trust and ongoing support of the ghost collector, then it deserves much more significant investment. Dr. Reeves looked like she might faint. What level of investment are you thinking about? Let's discuss endowing a new wing, Marcus Whitfield said. Something specifically dedicated to contemporary regional artists, the kind of work that Ms. Vasquez has been championing for decades. We could call it the Pacific Coast Contemporary Gallery. I felt overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. An hour ago, I had been an anonymous volunteer helping with a tour. Now I was being credited with influencing a major gift that could transform the museum. That's incredibly generous, I said, but I'm not sure I deserve credit for your decision. Of course you do, Marcus Whitfield replied. You've demonstrated something that's rare in our world, the ability to collect with genuine passion and knowledge, without ego or self-promotion. That's exactly the kind of approach that creates lasting cultural impact. The security guard, who had been standing frozen during this entire exchange, finally found his voice. Ms. Vasquez, I'm so sorry. I had no idea who you were. If I had known... I turned to him with a gentle smile. You were doing your job, Officer Martinez. You were protecting the art, which is exactly what you should do. The fact that I happen to own some of it doesn't change that. But Marcus Whitfield had a different perspective. Actually, Ms. Vasquez, I think this incident illustrates exactly why anonymity in collecting has limitations. Your expertise and passion for these works should be recognized and respected, not hidden. The art world needs more collectors like you, but it also needs to know who you are, so your approach can be studied and emulated. As we continued the tour, with my identity now revealed, the conversation took on a completely different character. Marcus Whitfield asked detailed questions about my collecting philosophy, my relationships with artists, my approach to lending and conservation. Dr. Reeves listened with fascination to aspects of my work that she had never heard before. Even his assistants, who had initially seemed bored by museum politics, became engaged in discussions about the intersection of collecting and public service. By the end of the afternoon, Marcus Whitfield had committed not just to funding a new wing, but to establishing an ongoing partnership with the museum focused on supporting emerging artists and expanding public access to contemporary art. He had also insisted that I be involved in the planning process, arguing that my experience and knowledge were essential to the project's success. "Ms. Vasquez," he said as we concluded the tour, "I hope you'll consider becoming more visible in the art world. Your approach to collecting could inspire a new generation of people who want to support art without ego or pretension." I wasn't sure how to respond to that suggestion. The idea of giving up my anonymity entirely felt overwhelming, but I also couldn't deny that the day's events had shown me possibilities I hadn't considered before. That evening, after Marcus Whitfield and his entourage had departed, Dr. Reeves and I sat in her office discussing what had happened. She was still processing the magnitude of the commitment he had made, but she was also concerned about how the revelation of my identity would affect our working relationship. "Elena, I want you to know that I will respect whatever level of privacy you want going forward," she said. "If you prefer to return to complete anonymity, I'll make sure that happens. Today was extraordinary, but I don't want you to feel pressured to change how you operate." I thought about her offer as I drove home through the evening fog. The security guard's confrontation, which had seemed so embarrassing and infuriating at the time, had accidentally opened a door that I had kept closed for decades. Meeting Marcus Whitfield had shown me that there were other serious collectors who shared my values, people who might benefit from knowing about my approach to supporting art and artists. But more importantly, the day had made me realize that my anonymity, while personally comfortable, might actually be limiting my ability to advocate for the things I cared about most: supporting emerging artists, making art accessible to the public, and encouraging a more thoughtful approach to collecting. Over the following weeks, word of my identity began to spread quietly through art world circles. Dr. Reeves had kept her promise to protect my privacy, but Marcus Whitfield had apparently shared the story of our meeting with other collectors and curators. I started receiving calls from museum directors, gallery owners, and other collectors who had heard about the Ghost Collector's revelation. Most of these conversations were respectful and focused on my work with artists and institutions. People were curious about my collecting strategy, my approach to lending, and my thoughts on the current state of the art market. Some wanted advice about supporting emerging artists. Others wanted to discuss collaborations between collectors and museums. But I also received attention that I found less comfortable. Art magazines wanted to do profiles. Auction houses wanted to consult with me about upcoming sales. Social organizations wanted to invite me to events and galas. The very aspects of the art world that I had avoided for decades were suddenly seeking me out. The most surprising contact came from Jennifer Walsh, the artist whose water lily painting had been the center of the confrontation with the security guard. She called me directly, having gotten my number from Dr. Reeves. "Elena," she said, "I had to call you personally to thank you. I just learned that you were the collector who bought my first paintings all those years ago. You have no idea what that meant to me at the time." "I remember that sale very clearly," I replied. "Your work was beautiful, and I could see that you had something special to offer." "But it was more than just a sale," Jennifer continued. "It was validation when I needed it most. I was ready to give up painting and find a more practical career. That purchase convinced me to keep going, to trust that there were people out there who understood what I was trying to do." Her words reminded me why I had started collecting in the first place. It wasn't about building a valuable collection or gaining recognition in the art world. It was about supporting creativity, about believing in artists when they needed it most, about being part of the process that brought beautiful and meaningful work into the world. Over the following months, I began to find a middle ground between complete anonymity and full public visibility. I remained selective about which events I attended and which interviews I accepted. I continued to make most of my purchases privately and to lend generously to museums without seeking publicity. But I also began to speak more openly about collecting philosophy and the importance of supporting emerging artists. The new wing at the Castellano Museum, funded by Marcus Whitfield's gift, opened a year later. It was officially called the Pacific Coast Contemporary Gallery, but everyone knew it had been inspired by my collection and approach to lending. The opening exhibition featured work by dozens of artists I had supported over the years, from established names to recent art school graduates. At the opening reception, I found myself in the unusual position of being a guest of honor, rather than an anonymous observer. Dr. Reeves introduced me to the crowd as a collector, who had helped shape the museum's contemporary program through her generous loans and her commitment to supporting regional artists. I was nervous about speaking in public about my collecting for the first time, but when I stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd, I saw faces that reminded me why this work mattered. There were artists whose careers I had supported, students who were learning about contemporary art for the first time, families who were discovering the joy of engaging with challenging and beautiful work. 25 years ago, I began, I bought my first piece of art with money I probably should have spent on rent. I did it because I believed that supporting creativity was important, that art makes us more human, and that sometimes the most meaningful thing you can do is believe in someone's vision before the rest of the world catches up. I talked about the artists I had met, the pieces that had moved me, the satisfaction of watching unknown creators gain recognition and success. I talked about the importance of museums as places where art could be shared with everyone, not just those wealthy enough to collect. Collecting isn't about ownership, I concluded. It's about stewardship. We hold these works temporarily, and our job is to make sure they're preserved, appreciated, and shared. The best collection is one that enriches not just the collector's life, but the lives of everyone who encounters it. After my speech, I was approached by dozens of people with questions, stories, and thanks. Young artists wanted advice about developing their careers. Other collectors wanted to discuss approaches to buying and lending. Museum professionals wanted to talk about partnerships and exhibitions. But the conversation that meant the most to me came from Officer Martinez, the security guard who had unknowingly triggered the events that led to this moment. He found me near the end of the reception, still looking slightly embarrassed about our earlier encounters. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, "I wanted to apologize again for how I treated you. I've learned a lot about your work with the museum, and I feel terrible about not recognizing your contributions." "Officer Martinez," I replied, "you have nothing to apologize for. You were protecting the art, which is exactly what you should have been doing. If anything, I should thank you." He looked confused. "Thank me? Your intervention that day forced me to step out of the shadows and into a conversation I didn't know I needed to have. It led to changes that have benefited the museum, the artists, and the community. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives come from unexpected encounters." As I drove home that night, I reflected on how much had changed since that morning, when I had stood too close to Jennifer Walsh's painting and been scolded by a well-meaning security guard. My carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered, but what had emerged in its place was something richer and more complex. I was still the same person who believed in supporting artists quietly and generously. I still preferred substance over publicity, impact over recognition. But I had learned that there were ways to be visible without being egotistical, ways to share knowledge and experience without seeking personal glory. The art world needed collectors who understood that their role was to nurture and share, not just to acquire and possess. By stepping forward, even reluctantly, I had found that I could be more effective in supporting the things I cared about. My collection continued to grow, but now it grew in partnership with others who shared my values. I collaborated with other collectors on joint acquisitions, worked with museums to plan exhibitions, and mentored young people who were interested in supporting the arts. The work felt more meaningful because it was more connected, more collaborative, more aware of its impact on the broader community. And sometimes, when I visited museums and galleries, I still stood a little too close to the paintings, studying brushstrokes and color relationships with the intensity that comes from true appreciation. But now, when security guards approached to remind me about proper viewing distance, I would smile and step back gracefully, remembering the day when such an encounter changed everything, and revealed that sometimes the most transformative moments come from the most ordinary interactions. The ghost collector was no longer invisible, but the work of supporting art and artists continued, now enhanced by the connections and collaborations that visibility had made possible. In stepping into the light, I had discovered that anonymity and recognition were not opposites, but different tools for achieving the same goal, creating a world where creativity could flourish and beauty could be shared by all. The morning after Marcus Whitfield's commitment to fund the new wing, I woke to 17 missed calls and 43 unread emails. My phone had been buzzing constantly since dawn, but I had turned off the sound and tried to pretend the outside world didn't exist for a few more hours. When I finally faced the digital avalanche, I realized that my decades of carefully maintained privacy had evaporated overnight. The first email was from Aten News, requesting an interview about my collecting philosophy and the impact of anonymous patronage on contemporary art. The second was from Christie's Auction House, inviting me to preview their upcoming contemporary art sale and offering private consultation services. The third was from someone claiming to be a documentary filmmaker who wanted to make a film about, quote, hidden collectors who shape the art world from the shadows. By the 10th email, a pattern had emerged. Everyone wanted something from me now that they knew who I was. Galleries wanted me to see their artists. Auction houses wanted me to consign pieces. Museums wanted me to lend to their exhibitions. Art advisors wanted to manage my collection. Journalists wanted my story. Social climbers wanted to invite me to their events. The phone calls were even more intrusive. An art advisor from Beverly Hills had called 6 times, leaving increasingly urgent messages about, quote, time-sensitive opportunities that required my immediate attention. A gallery owner from Chelsea had called 3 times, claiming he had been searching for me for years and had revolutionary artists I needed to see. Even a society photographer had called, offering to do a feature spread about my collection for a luxury lifestyle magazine. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and staring at my phone, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden attention. For 25 years, I had operated in peaceful anonymity, making decisions based purely on my love of art and my desire to support creativity. Now it seemed like everyone in the art world wanted to capitalize on my reputation or use my story for their own purposes. The most disturbing message came from someone named Victoria Ashford, who introduced herself as a collector relations specialist and claimed to have exciting partnership opportunities that could maximize the potential of my collection. She had somehow obtained my personal phone number and left a message that was both flattering and vaguely threatening. Elena, darling, her recorded voice purred, everyone is talking about you today. The ghost collector finally revealed. I represent several high-net-worth individuals who are very interested in collaborating with collectors of your caliber. There are significant financial opportunities here, but timing is crucial. The art market moves quickly, and windows of opportunity don't stay open long. I'll be in San Francisco tomorrow, and I really think we should meet. Something about her tone made my skin crawl. She spoke about art like it was a commodity to be traded, about my collection like it was a business opportunity to be exploited. Everything about her message went against the principles that had guided my collecting for decades. I deleted her voicemail and blocked her number, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she represented something larger and more troubling. My identity revelation hadn't just attracted people who genuinely cared about art. It had also drawn the attention of those who saw art primarily as an investment, who viewed collectors like me as resources to be mined for profit. Around noon, Dr. Reeves called. Her voice was strained, and I could hear stress in every word. Elena, I'm so sorry. I think our announcement yesterday may have gotten out of hand. My assistant tells me that reporters have been calling the museum all morning, asking for your contact information. Of course, we haven't given out any personal details, but somehow word has spread beyond what I expected it would. It's not your fault, Patricia, I said, though privately I was wondering how exactly the news had traveled so quickly. Marcus Whitfield seemed like a discreet person. I'm surprised the story spread so fast. Well, that's the thing, Dr. Reeves said hesitantly. I don't think it came from Marcus directly. His art advisor, Catherine, apparently mentioned the story to a journalist friend last night. She thought it was just a charming anecdote about meeting the mysterious ghost collector, but the journalist saw it as a major art world scoop. I felt a spike of anger. Catherine, who had seemed professional and knowledgeable during the museum tour, had essentially gossiped about my private business to a reporter. The casual betrayal stung more than the media attention itself. Has anything been published yet? I asked. There's a piece going online this afternoon in Art Daily, Dr. Reeves said. The journalist called me for comment, and I tried to keep it minimal, but she seemed to have quite a bit of information already. Elena, I'm worried this might snowball. She was right to be worried. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the Art Daily piece was live, titled "The Ghost Collector Revealed: How Elena Vasquez Became the Art World's Most Mysterious Patron." The article was accompanied by a photograph that someone had taken during Marcus Whitfield's museum tour, showing me in conversation with him in front of Jennifer Walsh's water lily painting. The piece was more accurate than I had feared, but more invasive than I had hoped. The journalist had clearly done her research, tracking down details about my lending history, my support of emerging artists, and even some information about the anonymous foundation I had established years earlier. She had interviewed several museum curators who spoke glowingly about working with me, though always under the protection of anonymity. But she had also speculated about the value of my collection, estimated my net worth, and quoted several art market experts about the potential impact of a major anonymous collector suddenly becoming visible. The tone was generally positive, but it reduced decades of careful, passionate collecting to a series of financial figures and market predictions. Worse, the article had attracted the attention of other media outlets. By evening, I had received interview requests from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and several art publications. My phone rang constantly with calls from journalists, gallery owners, and people claiming to be old friends who had lost touch, but were now eager to reconnect. The most troubling call came from someone who claimed to be representing a group of investors interested in creating a fund that would allow people to invest in emerging art markets. The caller, a man with a smooth voice and polished pitch, suggested that my, quote, proven track record of identifying undervalued artists could be leveraged into a profitable investment vehicle. "Think about it, Elena," he said, using my first name with a familiarity that made me uncomfortable. "You've been giving away your expertise for years, essentially providing free research and development for the art market. Why not monetize that knowledge? Our fund could offer shares in a portfolio of emerging artists, managed according to your collecting principles. Investors would get exposure to the next generation of important artists, and you would finally be compensated for your remarkable eye." I hung up without responding, but the conversation haunted me. Was this how the art world saw my decades of supporting artists? As free research and development, as a business model to be replicated and scaled? The suggestion that I should monetize my relationships with artists felt like a fundamental misunderstanding of everything I had tried to accomplish. The next morning brought a new wave of attention, but this time it felt more personal and more threatening. Someone had found my home address and mailed me a thick packet of materials from an art advisory firm based in New York. The cover letter was signed by someone named Harrison Blake III, who claimed to be a quote, senior partner in alternative asset management, and wanted to discuss strategic opportunities for optimizing your collection's performance. The packet included glossy brochures about art investment funds, case studies of successful collection monetization strategies, and a formal proposal for what they called comprehensive collection management services. They offered to handle everything from acquisitions and sales to insurance and tax optimization, taking a percentage of all transactions in return for their expertise. But what disturbed me most was a detailed analysis they had prepared of my collection, based apparently on publicly available information about my museum loans. They had created spreadsheets showing the estimated current value of pieces I had lent, calculated potential returns on my investments, and even suggested which works I should consider selling to rebalance my portfolio for maximum growth potential. Seeing my collection reduced to a series of financial projections felt like a violation. These people had never met me, had never seen most of the work they were analyzing, and had no understanding of why I had chosen to buy these particular pieces. They saw only dollar signs where I saw relationships with artists, memories of discovery, and decades of careful stewardship. I threw the entire packet in the trash, but more troubling packages followed. Art insurance companies wanted to review my coverage. Storage facilities offered climate-controlled warehouse space. Authentication services proposed conducting condition reports on my entire collection. Everyone seemed to assume that revealing my identity meant I was ready to transform my private passion into a commercial enterprise. The attention from legitimate art world professionals was overwhelming, but at least it was respectful. More disturbing were the approaches from people who seemed to view my collection as an opportunity for personal gain. I received emails from individuals claiming to be related to artists whose work I owned, suggesting that family provenance information could increase the value of my pieces. Others claimed to have additional works by artists in my collection, offering to sell them to me at special prices, as someone who clearly appreciated their significance. One particularly brazen approach came from someone who claimed to be organizing a charity auction and wanted me to donate a major piece to help raise funds for arts education. When I looked into the organization, I discovered it was essentially a front for a commercial gallery that would pocket most of the proceeds. The charity component was minimal, designed primarily to convince collectors to donate works that would then be sold for profit. But the most unsettling development was the attention from people who seemed to know details about my personal life that had never been made public. I received a letter from someone claiming to have known my grandmother in Lithuania, offering to sell me documents and photographs that would enhance the story of my collection. Another person claimed to have information about my early days in Portland, suggesting that my collecting success was somehow connected to insider information or unethical practices. These accusations were baseless, but they revealed how quickly the narrative around my identity was spinning out of control. People were creating stories about me to serve their own purposes, turning my decades of quiet collecting into fodder for conspiracy theories and gossip. 3 weeks after the Art Daily article was published, I made the decision to hire legal representation. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I needed protection from the increasingly aggressive approaches I was receiving. The lawyer I consulted, Maria Santos, specialized in privacy law for high-net-worth individuals and had experience dealing with unwanted media attention. "Elena," she said during our first meeting, "what you're experiencing is unfortunately common when someone with significant assets suddenly becomes visible. There's an entire ecosystem of people who make their living by identifying wealthy individuals and then finding ways to extract money from them. The art world has its own version of this, but the principles are the same." Maria recommended several immediate steps: hiring a security service to monitor my home address, setting up a filtering system for phone calls and emails, and establishing a formal protocol for responding to media requests. She also suggested that I consider hiring a legitimate art advisor, not to manage my collection commercially, but to help me navigate the business side of collecting that I had previously avoided. "You've been operating as a pure collector," she explained, "motivated by passion and aesthetics. But now that you're visible, people are going to approach you as a business entity. Having professional representation can help filter out the predators while preserving your ability to operate according to your values." The security assessment of my living situation was sobering. The consultant, a former police detective named Robert Chen, found that my personal information had been posted on several online forums dedicated to tracking wealthy collectors. Someone had photographed my apartment building and posted the images online, along with speculation about the value of any art I might keep at home. "Ms. Vasquez," Robert said, "you're not in immediate physical danger, but your privacy has been completely compromised. Anyone with basic internet skills can find your address, your phone number, and details about your daily routine. I recommend relocating to a more secure building and implementing some basic operational security measures." The idea of moving, of changing my entire life because of unwanted attention, felt deeply unfair. I had done nothing wrong except support art and artists for decades. Now I was being forced to hire lawyers and security consultants and consider relocating because other people wanted to profit from my reputation. But the final straw came when I discovered that someone was actively misrepresenting their relationship with me to potential clients. Victoria Ashford, the collector relations specialist, whose call I had blocked weeks earlier, was apparently telling art dealers and auction houses that she was my advisor and had authority to act on my behalf. She had created business cards identifying herself as senior advisor to Elena Vasquez collection and was using my name to gain access to private sales and exclusive preview events. When a gallery owner in Los Angeles called me directly to confirm a purchase Victoria had supposedly made on my behalf, I realized the situation had crossed from annoying to potentially damaging. Victoria was not just using my name for social access. She was attempting to commit fraud by impersonating my representative in financial transactions. Maria Santos moved quickly to address the situation, sending cease and desist letters to Victoria and anyone else who claimed to represent me without authorization. She also helped me establish an official statement clarifying that I had no art advisors and that anyone claiming to act on my behalf was doing so fraudulently. But dealing with Victoria Ashford revealed a larger problem. The art world, I was learning, was full of people who operated in the gray areas between legitimate business and outright fraud. They used personal relationships, insider information, and social connections to manipulate transactions and extract profits from collectors who might not understand the full implications of their deals. My decades of anonymous collecting had protected me from these predators, but visibility had made me a target. People now saw me as someone with both significant assets and potentially limited experience with the commercial side of the art world. They assumed that my focus on supporting artists rather than maximizing profits meant I was naive about business, an assumption they hoped to exploit. The most sophisticated attempt to manipulate me came from someone who presented himself as a fellow collector interested in collaboration. Charles Morrison contacted me through Dr. Reeves, claiming to be a longtime admirer of my collecting approach who wanted to discuss joint acquisitions and shared lending projects. Charles was smooth, knowledgeable, and seemingly legitimate. He owned a small but impressive collection of contemporary photography and had a history of supporting emerging artists through purchases and commissions. When he suggested we meet for lunch to discuss potential collaborations, I agreed, hoping to connect with someone who shared my values and approach to collecting. The lunch meeting at an expensive restaurant in Nob Hill started well. Charles was articulate about art, passionate about supporting creativity, and apparently well-connected in museum circles. He spoke intelligently about specific artists and exhibitions, demonstrating the kind of deep knowledge that comes from serious engagement with contemporary art. But as the conversation progressed, I began to sense an agenda beneath his apparent enthusiasm for collaboration. Charles kept steering the discussion toward the financial aspects of collecting, asking detailed questions about my acquisition strategies, my relationships with galleries, and my approach to evaluating emerging artists. "Elena," he said over dessert, "I have a proposition that I think could benefit both of us. I've been tracking several young artists who I believe are on the verge of major breakthroughs. If we coordinated our purchases, we could potentially influence their market development while also supporting their careers." The phrase, "influence their market development," raised red flags for me. I had always tried to support artists because I believed in their work, not to manipulate their market position for financial gain. "What do you mean by influencing market development?" I asked. Charles smiled and leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, when collectors of our caliber make strategic purchases, it sends signals to the broader market. If we both bought work by the same artist within a short time frame, it would create momentum that could help establish their commercial viability." I felt my stomach turn. Charles was essentially proposing market manipulation, using our reputations as collectors to artificially inflate demand for certain artists' work. The fact that he presented this as collaboration rather than exploitation didn't make it any less troubling. "Charles," I said carefully, "I appreciate your interest in supporting emerging artists, but I'm not comfortable with strategies designed to manipulate market prices. I prefer to buy work because I love it, not because I think it will appreciate in value." His expression shifted slightly, revealing something calculating beneath the charm. "Elena, I think you might be a bit naive about how the contemporary art market actually works. Collectors like us have influence whether we acknowledge it or not. The question is whether we use that influence strategically or just let market forces develop randomly." The condescending tone in his voice made me realize that Charles had fundamentally misunderstood both my motivations and my level of sophistication about the art world. He seemed to think that my focus on supporting artists rather than maximizing profits indicated a lack of business acumen, when in fact it reflected a deliberate choice to prioritize artistic integrity over financial gain. I ended the lunch politely but firmly, making it clear that I wasn't interested in collaborative market manipulation. Charles seemed surprised by my rejection, apparently having expected that appeals to profitability would override my ethical concerns. But the encounter with Charles Morrison taught me something important about how my public visibility was changing my relationships within the art world. People were approaching me with assumptions about my motivations, my knowledge, and my willingness to compromise my principles for financial advantage. Some saw me as an opportunity to be exploited, others as a resource to be leveraged, and still others as a naive idealist who needed education about how things really work. None of these characterizations felt accurate to who I was or what I had accomplished. I had been successfully navigating the art world for decades, building relationships with artists and institutions, and making collecting decisions that had proven both aesthetically and financially sound. My anonymity hadn't protected me because I was unsophisticated. It had protected me because I understood exactly how sophisticated the predators could be. The most painful aspect of losing my anonymity was discovering how many people in the art world were primarily motivated by financial considerations rather than aesthetic or cultural ones. Gallery owners who had seemed passionate about their artists' work revealed themselves to be focused mainly on sales figures and market positioning. Collectors who had appeared to be driven by love of art turned out to be primarily concerned with investment returns and social status. Even some of the artists I had supported over the years began to approach me differently once my identity became known. Instead of discussing their creative process or artistic development, they wanted to talk about market strategy and career advancement. They seemed to view our relationship less as patron and artist, and more as investor and investment opportunity. This shift in dynamics was heartbreaking, because it threatened to contaminate the pure joy I had always found in discovering and supporting new talent. For decades, my interactions with artists had been based on mutual respect for creativity and shared commitment to bringing beautiful work into the world. Now, those interactions were increasingly filtered through considerations of market value and commercial potential. The transformation was most evident in my relationship with David Kowalski, the first artist whose work I had ever purchased. David had been struggling when I bought 3 of his paintings years earlier, and my anonymous support had helped him continue developing his artistic practice. Over the years, he had become quite successful, with work in major museum collections and strong gallery representation. When David learned that I was the anonymous collector who had supported him early in his career, he called to express his gratitude. But the conversation quickly shifted from appreciation to business opportunity. David had apparently been saving several important early pieces, hoping to sell them to the right collector at the right time. Now that he knew I was both able and willing to support his work, he wanted to offer me first right of refusal on these pieces. "Elena," he said, "I've been holding on to some of my breakthrough works from the period right after you bought those first paintings. I always hoped they would go to someone who understood their significance. Given your support for my career and your reputation as a collector, I think these pieces belong with you." The offer was flattering, but something about David's approach bothered me. He was presenting the sale as a continuation of our patron-artist relationship, but he was also clearly motivated by the knowledge that my collection had significant value and that my name recognition could enhance the provenance of his work. I had always bought David's work because I loved it, not because I felt obligated to support his career or because I saw it as a good investment. Now he seemed to be appealing to a sense of duty or partnership that changed the fundamental nature of our relationship. When I expressed interest in seeing the works he was offering, David arranged for a private viewing at his studio. The paintings were indeed exceptional, representing a crucial period in his artistic development. But when he quoted prices that were 3 times what similar works had sold for at auction, I realized that he was factoring my identity and reputation into his valuation. "David," I said, "these are beautiful works, but your pricing seems to reflect more than just their artistic merit." He looked uncomfortable, but didn't deny the implication. "Elena, you have to understand that your ownership would significantly enhance the provenance of these pieces. Collectors pay premiums for works with exceptional collecting histories, and your reputation adds real value." I left David's studio without making any purchases, feeling deeply disappointed by the interaction. The artist I had supported for over a decade was now trying to extract additional value from our relationship, treating my collecting history as a commodity to be monetized rather than a shared commitment to art. Similar dynamics began to emerge in my relationships with galleries and museums. Institutions that had welcomed my anonymous loans now wanted to leverage my public identity for fundraising and publicity purposes. Gallery owners who had appreciated my quiet support now wanted to advertise my collecting history to attract other clients. Dr. Reeves, to her credit, remained respectful of my preferences and protective of our working relationship. But even she was under pressure from the museum's board to capitalize on my visibility for institutional advancement. "Elena," she said during one of our regular conversations, "I hope you know that our relationship hasn't changed from my perspective. You're still the same thoughtful, generous collector you've always been. But I have to be honest with you about the pressure I'm receiving to involve you more publicly in the museum's activities." "What kind of pressure?" I asked. "The board sees your visibility as an opportunity to attract other major collectors and donors. They want to organize events where you would speak about collecting philosophy, meet with potential supporters, and essentially serve as an ambassador for our approach to contemporary art." I appreciated Dr. Reeves's honesty, but the request troubled me. The museum wanted to use my reputation and relationships to further their institutional goals, which was understandable but felt like a fundamental shift in our partnership. For years, I had lent anonymously because I believed it was the right thing to do. Now they wanted me to lend my name and presence as well. The most frustrating aspect of all these changes was that they threatened to undermine the very qualities that had made my collecting successful in the first place. My ability to identify emerging talent had always been based on pure aesthetic judgment, unfiltered by market considerations or social pressures. My relationships with artists had been grounded in mutual respect and shared commitment to creativity. My collaborations with museums had been focused entirely on making great art accessible to the public. Now every interaction was complicated by considerations of market impact, commercial potential, and public relations value. Gallery owners wanted to know not just whether I liked an artist's work, but whether my support would influence other collectors. Artists wanted to understand not just whether I would buy their pieces, but whether my ownership would enhance their market position. Museums wanted not just my loans, but my endorsement and public presence. The transformation was exhausting and depressing. I had spent decades building a collecting practice based on love of art and commitment to supporting creativity. In just a few months, that practice had become entangled with financial calculations, social obligations, and commercial opportunities that felt foreign to everything I valued about engaging with art. But the most disturbing development was the emergence of people who seemed determined to profit from my story without my consent or participation. A gallery owner in New York had apparently created an exhibition called Collecting in the Shadows, The Legacy of Anonymous Patronage, featuring works by artists I had supported over the years. The gallery was using my story as a marketing hook without my permission, essentially monetizing my collecting history for their own benefit. When I learned about the exhibition through an art magazine preview, I was furious. The gallery owner, someone named Marcus Feldman, had apparently contacted several artists whose work I owned and convinced them to lend pieces for the show. He was promoting the exhibition as an exploration of anonymous collecting, using my recently revealed identity as the central narrative thread. The marketing materials for the show included quotes from our Art Daily interview, references to my collecting philosophy, and even speculation about which works in the exhibition I might own. Marcus Feldman was essentially using my reputation and story to attract visitors and sales, without my knowledge or consent. Maria Santos immediately sent a cease and desist letter to the gallery, demanding that they remove all references to me from their promotional materials and stop using my collecting history as a marketing tool. But the legal response would take time, and the damage to my privacy and reputation was already being done. The Collecting in the Shadows exhibition attracted significant media attention, with several art publications writing about the phenomenon of anonymous collecting and speculating about my motivations for remaining hidden for so long. Each article brought new attention to my personal story, further eroding the privacy I had worked so hard to maintain. But more troubling than the media coverage was the precedent the exhibition established. If gallery owners could profit from my collecting history without my consent, what would prevent others from doing the same? How many exhibitions, articles, and commercial ventures would use my name and reputation for their own purposes? The situation came to a head when I received a call from a publisher who wanted to commission a book about my collecting journey. The editor, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, explained that there was significant interest in stories about unconventional approaches to art patronage, and my decades of anonymous collecting would make for compelling reading. Elena, she said, your story represents something important about the relationship between art and commerce, about collecting as cultural stewardship rather than financial investment. We think a thoughtful memoir about your experiences could influence how people think about supporting artists and institutions. The offer was flattering, and Sarah Mitchell seemed to understand and appreciate my collecting philosophy. But the idea of writing a book about my experiences felt like the final step in a transformation I had never wanted. Publishing my story would make my visibility permanent and irreversible, turning my private passion into public property. Moreover, I was concerned about the impact that increased publicity would have on the artists and institutions I had supported over the years. Many of the artists I had helped early in their careers were now successful, but they had achieved that success through talent and hard work, not just because of my support. A book that positioned me as the architect of their careers would be unfair to their accomplishments and could create uncomfortable dynamics in our ongoing relationships. After much consideration, I declined the book offer, just as I had declined most of the other commercial opportunities that had emerged since my identity was revealed. But each refusal seemed to generate more interest rather than less, as if my reluctance to capitalize on my story made it more valuable to those who wanted to tell it for me. 6 months after the Art Daily article was published, I found myself living a completely different life than the one I had carefully constructed over the previous decades. I had moved to a secure apartment building in Pacific Heights, hired a personal assistant to screen my communications, and established formal protocols for all professional interactions. My quiet, private collecting practice had been transformed into something that required lawyers, security consultants, and media management. The most painful change was in my relationship with art itself. For the first time in decades, I found myself second-guessing my responses to new work, wondering whether my aesthetic judgments were being influenced by considerations of market impact or public perception. When I visited galleries or studios, I was acutely aware of how artists and dealers were observing my reactions, looking for signals about my purchasing intentions or investment strategies. The pure joy I had always found in discovering exceptional art was being contaminated by the commercial and social complications that came with public visibility. Every interaction was filtered through considerations of how it might be perceived, reported, or leveraged by others for their own purposes. But as difficult as these changes were, they also clarified something important about my values and priorities. The attention and opportunities that had emerged since my identity was revealed were not inherently bad, but they were fundamentally incompatible with the approach to collecting that had given my life meaning for so many years. I realized that I needed to find a way to preserve the essence of what had made my collecting practice fulfilling, while adapting to the reality that my anonymity could never be fully restored. The question was whether it was possible to remain true to my principles while operating in a world that now knew who I was and wanted to capitalize on that knowledge. The answer to that question would determine not just my future as a collector, but my ability to continue supporting the artists and institutions that had made my decades of involvement with art so personally meaningful. The stakes, I was beginning to understand, were much higher than just my personal privacy or comfort. They were about preserving space in the art world for approaches to collecting that prioritized cultural value over commercial gain, relationships over transactions, and long-term stewardship over short-term profit. That preservation would require more than just saying no to unwanted opportunities. It would require actively defending and demonstrating alternative approaches to collecting, even if doing so meant accepting a level of public visibility that I had never wanted. The real test of my commitment to supporting art and artists was just beginning. The solution came to me during a quiet Sunday morning visit to the Castellano Museum, 8 months after my identity had been revealed. I was standing in the Pacific Coast Contemporary Gallery, the new wing that Marcus Whitfield's donation had made possible, watching a family with young children discover art for the first time. The parents were reading wall labels aloud while their daughter, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, stood transfixed by a vibrant abstract painting, pointing excitedly at colors and shapes that captured her imagination. This was why I had started collecting in the first place. Not for recognition, not for profit, not for social status, but for moments like this when art connected with people in immediate, authentic ways. The little girl didn't care who owned the painting or how much it was worth. She was simply responding to beauty and creativity with the kind of pure enthusiasm that made all the complications and compromises worthwhile. That morning, I made a decision that would reshape how I approached collecting for the rest of my life. Instead of trying to return to anonymity or fully embracing public visibility, I would create a third path that preserved my core values while acknowledging the reality of my changed circumstances. I called Dr. Reeves that afternoon and arranged a meeting to discuss a new kind of partnership between my collection and the museum. Rather than simply lending individual pieces for specific exhibitions, I wanted to establish a permanent program that would make contemporary art more accessible to audiences who might not otherwise encounter it. Patricia, I explained during our meeting the following week, I've been thinking about how to use this unwanted visibility for something positive. What if we created a program that takes art directly to communities that can't easily visit museums, schools, community centers, senior housing facilities, places where people encounter barriers to cultural engagement? Dr. Reeves's eyes lit up with interest. You're talking about a traveling exhibition program? More than that, I said. I'm talking about a comprehensive outreach initiative that combines art display with education and community engagement. We could rotate selections from my collection through these venues, but also provide artist talks, workshops, and educational materials that help people understand and appreciate contemporary art. The program I envisioned would be called Art in Community, and it would represent everything I believed about the purpose of collecting. Instead of hoarding beautiful objects in private spaces or even limiting them to traditional museum settings, we would actively bring art to people where they lived, worked, and gathered. Over the following months, Dr. Reeves and I worked with her team to develop the infrastructure for art in community. We identified partner organizations throughout the Bay Area, from elementary schools in underserved neighborhoods to community centers in rural towns. We developed educational materials that would help viewers engage with contemporary art without requiring specialized knowledge. We trained a team of artist educators who could facilitate meaningful conversations about creativity and cultural expression. Most importantly, we established clear guidelines that would protect both the artworks and my collecting philosophy. Participating venues had to meet specific security and environmental standards to ensure the safety of the pieces. All educational materials emphasized artistic process and cultural significance rather than market value. And my role in the program was presented simply as collector and program founder, without the sensationalized narrative that had emerged from media coverage of my identity revelation. The first Art in Community installation opened at Roosevelt Elementary School in Oakland, a Title I school where many students had never been to an art museum. We selected 15 pieces from my collection that would engage young viewers, including several works by artists who had grown up in similar communities and could serve as inspiration for the students. I attended the opening quietly, standing at the back of the school cafeteria while students encountered the art for the first time. Their reactions were immediate and honest. They asked questions about technique, shared personal connections to subject matter, and debated interpretations with the kind of intellectual curiosity that reminded me why art education was so important. One student, a fourth grader named Maya, spent 20 minutes studying a photograph by Sarah Martinez, the Immigrant Family Series 1, had supported years earlier when Sarah could barely afford film. Maya's own family had immigrated from El Salvador, and she saw something in Sarah's work that resonated with her personal experience. "This looks like when we first came here," Maya told the artist educator leading her group. My mom was scared but trying to be brave, just like the lady in the picture. Watching Maya connect with Sarah's work, understanding that my collection had helped preserve and share stories that mattered to young people like her, reminded me why I had fallen in love with collecting in the first place. This was the impact I had always hoped to have, but on a scale and with a directness that my anonymous lending had never achieved. The success of the Roosevelt Elementary installation led to rapid expansion of Art in Community. Within 6 months, we had active programs in 12 locations, from senior centers in San Francisco to youth programs in rural Marin County. Each installation was carefully curated to resonate with its specific audience, while maintaining the highest standards of artistic quality. The program also attracted the attention of other collectors who were inspired by its approach to making art accessible. Marcus Whitfield contacted me about contributing pieces from his own collection, and several other Bay Area collectors offered both artworks and financial support for expansion. But most gratifying was the response from artists whose work was featured in the program. Many of them had never seen their pieces displayed in community settings, and they were moved by how directly their work connected with diverse audiences. Several artists began creating new works specifically for art and community installations, pieces designed to engage with community stories and experiences. David Kowalski, despite our earlier awkward interaction about pricing, offered to donate a new painting specifically for the program. When I visited his studio to see the work, our conversation focused entirely on artistic vision and community engagement rather than market considerations or financial arrangements. "Elena," he said, "seeing my early work in these community settings reminds me why I became an artist in the first place. It's not about galleries or collectors or art fairs. It's about making something that speaks to people's lives and experiences." The success of art and community also provided a framework for addressing some of the commercial pressures that had emerged since my identity was revealed. When galleries or auction houses approached me with investment opportunities, I could redirect their attention to the program and its mission. When journalists wanted to write about my collecting, I encouraged them to focus on art and community rather than my personal story. This approach wasn't about avoiding attention entirely, but about channeling it towards something constructive and meaningful. Instead of being defensive about unwanted publicity, I was proactive about directing interest toward work that exemplified my values and priorities. The strategy proved effective in multiple ways. The exploitative approaches that had plagued me in the first months after my identity revelation began to decrease, as it became clear that I wasn't interested in commercial ventures. Art world predators moved on to easier targets, while legitimate professionals began to understand and respect my commitment to cultural rather than financial value. But the most important impact was on my own relationship with collecting. For the first time since my identity had been revealed, I was able to visit galleries and artist studios with the same sense of discovery and possibility that had driven my collecting for decades. Knowing that exceptional work might find its way into art and community installations gave me a new sense of purpose and excitement about identifying emerging talent. I also began to appreciate aspects of visibility that I had initially resisted. When young artists learned that their work might be featured in community settings rather than stored in private collections, they often shared more openly about their creative processes and cultural influences. These conversations enriched my understanding of their work and helped me make more thoughtful collecting decisions. 2 years after my identity was revealed, art and community had grown into a nationally recognized model for community-based cultural programming. Museums and collectors across the country had contacted us about replicating the program in their own regions. Art education organizations had begun incorporating our materials and methods into their curricula. The recognition was gratifying, but more important was the impact we were having on individual lives and communities. Teachers reported that students who had participated in art in community installations showed increased interest in creative expression and cultural learning. Community-centered directors noted that art programming had sparked broader conversations about identity, history, and possibility among their participants. On a personal level, I had found a way to reconcile my commitment to privacy with the reality of public visibility. I still avoided art world social events and declined most media interviews, but I was no longer hiding from my identity as a collector. Instead, I was actively demonstrating what collecting could look like when it prioritized cultural impact over personal recognition. The program also provided a model for other collectors who shared my values but had been reluctant to become publicly involved in the art world. Several private collectors had contacted me about establishing similar programs in their own regions, creating a network of collection-based community outreach that was beginning to influence how museums and cultural institutions thought about public engagement. Standing in the Pacific Coast Contemporary Gallery on the second anniversary of Marcus Whitfield's visit, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that morning, when Officer Martinez had scolded me for standing too close to my own painting. The embarrassing encounter that had accidentally revealed my identity had ultimately led to work that was more meaningful and impactful than anything I had accomplished during my decades of anonymous collecting. I was no longer the ghost collector, invisible and mysterious. But I had become something more valuable, a collector whose work demonstrated that art could be a force for community building, cultural understanding, and social connection. My collection was still growing. My relationships with artists were still based on mutual respect and shared commitment to creativity, and my lending to museums continued to support excellent exhibitions. But now all of that work was part of a larger vision about art's role in society and collecting's potential to serve communities rather than just collectors. The unwanted attention that had once felt like a violation of my privacy had become an opportunity to advocate for approaches to cultural engagement that prioritized access over exclusivity, education over investment, and community impact over personal prestige. As I walked through the gallery that afternoon, past paintings and sculptures that represented decades of careful collecting and thoughtful lending, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with market value or critical recognition. The art I had chosen to support was making a difference in people's lives, connecting communities to creativity, and demonstrating that collecting could be an act of cultural stewardship rather than personal accumulation. The little girl who had stood transfixed by that abstract painting 2 years earlier was now in second grade, and her teacher had told me that she still talked about the colors and shapes she had discovered during that first art and community installation. Maya, the fourth grader who had connected with Sarah Martinez's immigration photographs, was now in middle school and had joined her school's art club. These were the measures of success that mattered to me, the outcomes that justified all the complications and compromises that had followed my identity revelation. I was still Elena Vasquez, still passionate about art and committed to supporting creativity. But I was no longer hiding that passion or limiting its impact to private satisfaction. The ghost collector had been revealed, but what had emerged was something more substantial and lasting, a collector whose work proved that art belonged not in shadows or spotlights, but in the daily lives and shared experiences of communities everywhere. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.